little bit further, you get into animal husbandry, the first cities in Ur and Babylon, and then you go all the way out to the end there, you know, and that's the iPhone, the end of that blue line there, all right? So what you can see is incredibly stable global temperatures until we hit the Industrial Revolution, and then it just shoots up, right? And the question for policy and for our futures is, how high are we gonna let this thing go? And the red line there is how high it could go, depending upon what we do. What we probably can do if we get everything right is about that. So holding global temperatures under 2 degrees C or about 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase over the pre-industrial levels. That's the optimistic but still realistic target. You might have heard of 1.5 degrees as kind of what we would like to have done, but we just got a report earlier this year that says we're going to blow through that by 2030 something, and that could actually happen in the next couple of years, because we're coming out of, in terms of the decadal cycles, we're coming out of a period called La Nina, where there's a lot of heat stored in the Pacific Ocean, into an El Nino, where much of that heat gets released in the atmosphere. And the last time that happened, over the course of 2014, 15, 16, and 17, the planet actually heated up 1/4 degree C, or about 4 degrees, I'm sorry, 1/2 degree Fahrenheit in just 3 years. So it's going to be the hottest year ever next year or the year after, undoubtedly, and it could be very hot. So get used to that. It's going to be distressing and depressing to see us break through global temperature records yet again over a 2 or 3 year period. But it doesn't mean game over. I mean, we know that's coming. It means we've just got a lot of work to do to hold it to that 2 degree Fahrenheit warming. I'm not going to elaborate on what it means to go beyond 2 degrees. You guys have heard that plenty, so. All right. Kind of the industrial policy story around climate change goes back a long ways. And in particular, when I was 18 and a freshman at college, I bought this book called Soft Energy Paths on the left there. And it had just come out. There was a physicist named Amory Lovins who wrote the book with assistance from his partner, Hunter Lovins. And Amory sort of laid out this very compelling story about, at the time it was more about energy security and less about climate change, because we didn't really know, I mean, we were getting the first inklings of climate change in the late 70s. But sort of arguing that in order to unhook from our addiction to fossil fuels, which was damaging from a national security perspective, that we needed to engage in very active industrial policy to drive down the costs of solar and wind and take what he called the soft path rather than the hard path of nuclear and coal powered electricity. And he was really one of the first people to say that this was actually going to be the cheapest thing to do, that this wasn't an expensive initiative, that ultimately this was going to be the efficient approach to economic development over the long run. Jimmy Carter probably read that book, and at the time advocated for a real sort of moonshot approach to investing in solar, with a goal of 20% solar by 2020, by 2000, and famously put solar panels on the roof of the White House. So that story was very much alive in the 70s. But then it really got squashed for about 30 years, at least in the United States and significantly around the world. And we'll talk about why in a minute. But I've been very much engaged with this idea since then. I wrote the first edition of my textbook in 1992 and had a chapter on promoting clean technology, which was very much this kind of industrial policy vision. And I wrote again about it in the early 2000s. So what happened in 1980 that sort of derailed us from solving the climate crisis much earlier? And it was neoliberalism, which I'm sure you all are familiar with as a concept. But it was sort of the rise of a privatized and liberalized ideology, a time in which, at least in America, the economics profession became very distrustful of state intervention and very enamored of the idea of market solutions to social problems. Um, and so there was a lot of people that in the economics profession that were sort of savaging the idea of state-led development and industrial policy. And the basic story was governments don't know how to pick winners, right? Why would we think that governments would be smart enough to know where to invest? And much better left to the market. Climate change is a problem, yes, said the neoliberal economists, but we're going to solve it with a market mechanism. So we're either going to tax pollution or we're going to impose a cap and trade system where we cap total pollution even under a shrinking cap, but let people trade permits that they buy from the government in order to gain some sort of short-run efficiencies. And the basic idea was that economists were really thinking about climate change as a negative externality. You know, you guys are maybe familiar with that term. You know, an externality is, you know, a cost or a benefit of a market transaction that's not borne by the consumers or producers. And certainly it is an externality in some sense, right? When I drove my car here this morning, I burned a lot of gasoline, and you know, the social costs that I imposed on the world as a consequence of doing that, you know, the addition to carbon dioxide, I'm not paying for, and neither are the oil companies, right? So as a result, I'm consuming too much gasoline, and so the classic economics sort of response to that is a Pigouvian tax, or as I said, some sort of cap and trade system. But it's sort of a stupid way to think about something as huge as climate change, right? It's way more complicated than that. And the problem with those market-based solutions, economists were advocating them very aggressively for the last 30 years, is they impose sort of huge costs on consumers because you don't have substitutes available, right? So you impose gasoline taxes, and the idea is, well, that's going to make the dirty technologies more expensive and incentivize investment in the clean technologies. But you're really putting the cart before the horse in some sense, because in the meantime, everybody's got to pay really high prices for necessities. And it's going to be a very slow process by which those kind of alternative technologies then emerge and provide opportunities for people to substitute away from those technologies. And an example would be that in Europe, as you probably know, they've historically had gas prices that were 4 times as high in the US. And yet that didn't fundamentally alter the automobile market. It made, you know, people had smaller cars in Europe, but they didn't move away from internal combustion engines because there was no private sector sort of drive into that space. People just lived with higher prices. So it's a flawed mechanism for thinking about something as fundamental as climate change. And really, it's a design problem. That's the way we should think about it. You can talk about path-dependent technology, right? So we've gone down a path of investment in fossil fuels. We're locked in. You know, everybody needs it. We've got systems, you know, whole economic systems that are integrated around that idea. We've got freeways and, you know, transport systems, and everything is sort of working to support and reinforce an addiction to that fossil fuel system. So if you want to get off of it, you've got to build an alternate pathway. And if you do that, and you do it right, and as you start to build out those alternative systems, and ideally you're going to start to gain cost reductions through economies of scale and learning by doing, and network externalities, and the costs of those alternatives are going to start to fall. And then at some point, you know, you've built out that alternative energy system, and then you can make the transition, right? And that is kind of the alternative economic paradigm that is the right one, that I've been talking about for a long time, and now everybody's come around to my viewpoint, which I'm happy about. So let me tell you, you know, we've talked about sort of the grim news about climate change. Let me tell you about some good thing about your future, okay? So sometime in your lifetime, the world will be essentially 60% powered by cheap, abundant solar energy combined with storage systems like batteries, you know, stuff we've got in our phones, but also conversion of solar power and wind power to things like hydrogen and liquid fuels. So we'll figure out ways to take that solar energy, produce electricity, and then turn it into things that we can store, okay? This is coming just by virtue of the fundamental economics. And we'll see that in a minute. Once this happens, there's a bunch of good things that are going to happen as a result. First, it will solve climate change. Where on that scale is problematic, right? But we're going to get there. We will get there in the next few decades. It will clean the air in cities, and this is really why the Chinese have largely embraced renewable energy plus electric vehicles, because you know, as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, millions of Chinese people were dying every year as a consequence of exposure to really bad urban air pollution. They've been made some big progress as a result of this move towards electric vehicles. So as we get coal-fired power plants shut down and gas-fired cars or gasoline-powered cars shut down, that's really going to clean up the air. It's going to end energy poverty. Right, so we've still got a couple billion people around the world who don't have access to reliable energy or electricity. That may sound romantic, but you know, just try it for 3 days and see how that feels. It's liberating, right, to have access to energy. That will come, and then also, you know, in my mind, one of the most important features is that it's going to break the back of the sort of corruption that sort of inherently accumulates around the fossil fuel sector, right? Because our energy technologies of the 20th century were, you know, were almost natural monopolies, right? There's very few people in the world who have kind of gained access to control over coal, oil, utilities, transmission lines, and that's really generated a concentration of wealth and power that we've seen massive corruption and destruction from. So the war in the Ukraine, fully brought to you by the fossil fuel industry, right? The fact that one man has really, you know, monopolized control over hundreds of billions of dollars of fossil fuel revenue allows him to prosecute a war. But the corruption is evident in many countries around the world, including in the United States, where the reason that we are 30 years late in addressing the climate change can be traced directly to the political influence of the fossil fuel industry. So solar is inherently a democratic technology, it's a democratizing technology, and it's going to create a different world in terms of our relationship to energy. So all that good stuff is coming really courtesy of industrial policy. There was pushback against industrial policy in the US and in other places through the kind of Washington Consensus and sort of the rise of neoliberal economics, but it still went on. And the US had its own version of that. There were a variety of renewable energy subsidies. In the early 2000s, the Germans got into this in a big way with their Energiewende policies, specifically about ensuring that Germany was going to be a leader in solar energy. The Danes have been doing this in wind power. There's a reason that Vestas is a Danish company. It's one of the biggest turbine manufacturers in the world. And then the Chinese really made a commitment in about 2008 or 9 or 10 to really seek to dominate in solar and electric vehicle technology. So beginning in those eras, we really saw, you know, globally sort of continued engagement with this, and it's really worked. I mean, solar prices have fallen about 10% a year since the late 70s, and I'll blow up just that last little bit there. You can see they're continuing to go down. And there's no reason to think they're stopping, right? We're still essentially using the technology that was developed for the space age in terms of silicon solar photovoltaics, and there's lots of new technology that is in incubation right now that will allow us to really explore the frontiers of solar energy. And it's just ridiculously cheap even now, right? So, do I have that next slide? Let me see what I've got. Yeah, you can see that if you look at utility scale solar and onshore wind, it was really about 2018 or 19 globally that the cost curves really crossed, and both wind and solar became cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuels, which would be a new natural gas plant. So if you look at Western US sort of unregulated markets, the cheapest fossil fuels will come in about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and the cheapest wind, solar, battery storage combinations that give you reliable power will come in at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. We're getting 1.1 cent kilowatt hour sort of bids in the Middle East. So the wholesale generating cost of solar is now just well below fossil fuels, and essentially all new electricity generating capacity globally that's not heavily subsidized is wind or solar. Here in the US even, I think we had about 80% of new generating capacity that was built last year was renewables. So we've kind of solved the new construction problem. We still have subsidies for coal and other things that are problematic, but in terms of market economics, we've crossed that threshold where investors are not interested in conventional technologies unless they can be provided with really high subsidies. Let me just go, what was that? Get rid of that. And on the vehicle side, you know, very similar story, right? We've seen similar sort of reduction in prices for batteries. Electric vehicle prices are coming down. There was a piece yesterday about massive price wars in China. The Shanghai Auto Show is all about electric vehicles. Everybody's committed to a transition to close to 100% electric by 2035. And so these are really powerful policy stories. It's a huge policy win. It's late in coming. It could have happened 20 years earlier, but the fact that we are in a position to solve the climate change and keep it under 2 degrees C, we can really thank Jimmy Carter and the sort of world of people around him who kept that dream alive in terms of US commitments, even in tough times, and then of course globally. So here's where we've got to go. You can see that solar's only now about 3%, even though it's been growing fast. Wind's up to about 9%. We need to get, depending upon, you know, our target, somewhere between 50 and 95% within 30 years. That's the shift that we have to make to stabilize the climate. That seems like impossible, but it's not. You can just actually take a look at what's happened to coal since 2000. It's gone from 50% down to 20%, and it's continuing to go fast towards zero. So rapid energy transitions are possible. They're complicated, but they are possible. What humans are trying to do now is the biggest thing we have ever done. This is bigger than World War II. It's bigger than the pyramids. It's bigger than anything. Trying to transition the entire global energy system away from fossil fuels in 30 years. But it's really now underway all over the world. So in the US, we've got a lot of federal policy that happened last year. We've got very active state policy in California, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, other places. And I'll talk about the New York case in a minute. The EU, you know, the Russian invasion has doubled down on the EU's commitment to a renewable energy transition, as they've, going back to Amory Lovin's vision of energy insecurity, that's what they have in spades. So they realize, they have a pathway now to get off of Russian oil and gas with some kind of rapid decarbonization policy. And again, China is absolutely committed to this space as well. Even while they continue to license coal plants, they are, by far the global leader in terms of installed capacity for renewables. And this may be the last burst of kind of coal interest. And then it's also happening in lots of other places. So I'm teaching an energy policy class this year, and for the last 30 years, whenever I teach this class, it's always been, well, here's what we should do, right? And now I can talk about what we are doing, and it's really kind of, it is an exciting time, right? Because attention has turned where it should be. Always have to think about speed here, though, because we talk about in our sort of justice work that urgency is one of the habits of white supremacy, right? And people get steamrolled under sort of the mantra of urgency. And in this case, we really do have some urgency, right? But we need to take that lesson to heart and recognize that there could be a lot of injustice emerging from an unjust transition. But on the other hand, there could be a lot of justice that comes out of a just transition. And so we need to think about both the pollution and exploitation of labor and communities that can happen in the switch from fossil fuels to renewables and storage. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to ensure that the benefits from the transition go to low-income and frontline and marginalized communities in the transition. So this is a big part of the dialogue in places where it can be, and we need to push that very, very far. Okay, so what has happened in the U.S.? I've got the 30-year stall here. I remember when I first heard about global warming, it was 1981, so I was a junior in college, and I was part of an anti-nuclear group, and we had our meeting. There's this guy named Al L. who was like 35 or something and had long blonde hair and a guitar, and for some reason he was still coming to student group meetings, one of those guys that was hanging around too long at college. But he showed up, and I remember he was ashen-faced and just looked really scared, and he said, the government scientists have proved it. There's this thing called the greenhouse effect, and we're all gonna die. And we were like, oh, that's just Al. Whatever, he's just going on about some conspiracy theory thing. But he was right, and then about 6 years later, we kind of had the official acceptance by the scientific community that stuff was happening. And then in 1992, under President George W. Bush, H.W., the first George Bush, the U.S. actually signed and ratified a UN Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And it was actually voted in favor, 95-0 in the U.S. Senate, ratification of that treaty. Impossible to imagine now, right? But it was a different world, and it was before the polarization that has so kind of torn us apart, right, since then. But since then, the federal government really has done nothing explicitly on climate, like zero in 30 years. There was, California's taken a leadership role. There was an attempt under the Obama administration to put together a cap and trade, but it fell apart. Obama did accelerate the kind of the industrial policy piece under the guise of the Recovery Act of 2009. So we had a burst of clean energy subsidies that emerged at that time, which were helpful. Then the next big move really came from New York, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, with the Community Leadership and Climate Protection Act, which is very ambitious. 70% renewable energy by 2030, that's 7 years from now. 100% emission-free by 2040. And then finally, the Democrats really embraced this idea of clean technology promotion in the infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill this year. And it's kind of interesting that we haven't really even seen much of a peep of the critique of industrial policy that was so dominant in the 80s and 90s. There's very few people getting up and saying, well, government shouldn't do this, they can't pick winners. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that the Democrats have moved to the left economically, and climate change has really freaked out everybody. And so there's really no opposition within the Democratic Party to this kind of industrial policy, at least in principle. And then the Republicans have just abdicated on economics. I mean, they just don't talk about it anymore because they're so obsessed with culture war stuff that they just don't, you know, you anticipate that someone from the middle right would sort of have some sort of substantive challenge to this, but it's been more about kind of a knee-jerk reaction rather than a kind of intellectually interesting argument about why the government shouldn't be doing this. So I think industrial policy is the order of the day, and I don't see kind of a neoliberal blowback coming at this particular piece of it. And so let's step back and say, okay, having framed that, and we've got this legislation, what is it actually supposed to do? How does it get us to where we want to be in terms of climate change? And here are the 4 things you have to do to stabilize the climate. The first thing is you got to do is you got to build lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of renewable energy and storage. Because if you think about what you're doing is you're electrifying everything, which was actually the second step. So we're going to have electric vehicles. We're going to get rid of, you know, fuel oil heating systems, and we're going to get rid of propane heating systems and natural gas heating systems. So we're going to heat all our buildings with electricity. We're going to drive our cars on electricity. We're going to use electricity for industrial purposes. So we need actually double the amount of electricity generation that we're getting because we're going to need more of it, not less of it. So you got to build lots of renewables, and then you got to go through and electrify everything. And so, for example, over the last couple of years, I have electrified my heating systems in the property that I own. I had one building that was on natural gas, propane, and another building that was on fuel oil, and we installed, you know, heat pumps, and now we're nice and warm, and we're using pretty clean energy in upstate New York, electricity to power that instead of emitting fossil fuels. Haven't got the electric vehicle yet, got the plug-in hybrid, so at least the first 15 miles is electric, but after that it's gas. So those are the first 2 steps. We have to do that with everything. Then find specialized solutions for hard to decarbonize sectors like concrete, steel, aviation, so those are some harder ones to crack. And then finally, suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And you've probably heard of regenerative agriculture and techniques to get carbon into the soil, as well as the potential for sort of industrial methods of carbon capture and sequestration. But this is really what the policy is trying to achieve. And I want to give you one case study, so I'll end up on that. And that is the what's happening here in New York State. And I love this picture because it gives you a sense of sort of how fast energy transitions can happen. And this was also New York, so it's nice to illustrate that. So on the left, you've got Easter morning, 1900, Fifth Avenue. There is one automobile in that picture that is circled in red. 13 years later, same day, there is one horse somewhere in there. All right? And you guys are obviously familiar with very rapid, yes, like, where's Waldo, right? You're familiar with very rapid technology disruption, because obviously when you were born there was no such thing as smartphones, and now 3 billion people on the planet have got, the power of the internet in their pocket. So you know that this stuff can happen fast. What's different about energy is it takes up a lot of, it's an industrial project on a pretty massive scale. So let's look at what's happening in particular with offshore wind in New York, because it's actually really interesting. Usually states don't really have the capacity to do industrial policy because they're too small, right? But New York is big enough to be able to do that. And so again, we've got this 2019 law passed that with targets, including 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, and in particular, a mandate that New York was going to build 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That's about the equivalent of 6 big nuclear power plants of power. So that's enough power to power about 5 million homes, kind of half the size of New York City. It's a huge amount of electricity. And it's a major, major, major industrial project. Billions of dollars in infrastructure, and this is 30% of New York's electricity load, about half of New York City's load. These are gargantuan things. You can take a look at how big they are relative to the Empire State Building. So the turbines they're going to put up are at least as big as the ones on the far right there. In order to get there, you've got to build a lot of stuff, and you've got to hire a lot of people, and you've got to build a lot of transmission lines. But we're not stopping there, right, in terms of industrial development. That's just New York. So all of the East Coast states combined now have 50 megawatts, 50 gigawatts, 50,000 megawatts planned by 2035. So that's the equivalent of about 30 big nuclear power plants. The federal offshore goals, as part of the Biden vision and plan, is 110,000 gigawatts by 2050. So that's, again, the equivalent of, let's say, 80 really big nuclear power plants. As a country, we just haven't built that much stuff in that short a time in a long time, right? Since the 70s, we haven't really had any kind of infrastructure push. And this is it's a very different story than sort of Americans have experienced since really the 60s and early 70s. Okay, to get there, they're envisioning a lot of manufacturing of the towers and the blades and the bolts and the cables and all that stuff happening in the Hudson Valley, and in particular at the Port of Coymans and the Port of Albany, so 2 ports up the Hudson River. You need lots of electricians, obviously, to do all of that renovation, and then a lot of jobs in the ports themselves, right, which will be off Long Island. And the vision here is, how do you ensure that, those jobs are benefiting, low income and marginalized communities. And so there's a lot of stakeholder engagement involved in this process, a lot of bringing in community groups, trying to figure out where to put the training facilities, and how is all this getting paid for? Okay? Well, the way it's getting paid for is really by the developers. So the developers come in with a bid for power, and they've got to agree as part of their bid to invest tens, 30s, hundreds of millions of dollars in these port facilities, get partners to invest in these manufacturing facilities, provide funding for training. Now, ultimately, that money's going to come out of our pockets as ratepayers, right? Because the way that those developers are going to pay for it is they're going to build the turbines, they're going to get paid for the electricity, right? And out of the money that they're getting paid for the electricity, they're setting aside chunks of it for these economic development activities, right? So it's not government using tax dollars per se for this industrial policy. It's actually using money that is coming ultimately from ratepayers. So it's kind of a hidden tax, if you will, on your electricity bill. That's okay because the power's going to be cheap, right? So it's not like people's bills are going to go up. In fact, they're going to go down. But they're not going to go down as much as they would if we weren't also paying for all of that economic development, okay? But that's really the process. That's where the money's coming from to enable the build out of this infrastructure to then support the growth of these opportunities. So, you know, here's the phases of, you know, phase one is marquee investments in blades, cables, ports, and then on out. A lot of technical working groups, a lot of consulting, environmental impacts, fisheries, maritime, commerce, et cetera, you know, that's got to go on to coordinate all this stuff and, again, try and get the benefits flowing to environmental justice communities. And in particular, what was unique about New York State law, I didn't mention this, was a requirement that 30% of the benefits associated with the development of green renewable energy have to go to what are designated as disadvantaged communities. So they actually went through a process of designating census tracts that are supposed to receive at least 30% of the total benefits. So there is a guiding environmental justice dimension behind the policy. Workforce training, transmission planning is huge. You can kind of see what's going on. The nice thing about offshore wind is you don't have to disrupt a lot of, you know, land-based communities with transmission lines. You can bring a lot of it in from the ocean. But there is still, you know, a lot of issues related to building out the transmission system and reorienting it away from pulling power down from upstate. And also, downstate really produces a lot of electricity with really dirty sources, coal and natural gas. So we're going to shut all those down as the clean energy comes online. Okay, I want to save a little time for questions. I can talk a little bit about our graduate programs at the end, but I guess the bottom line here is that we are, industrial policy and climate policy are now firmly intertwined. It is the way forward. There's competition. The Europeans are unhappy about the Buy American provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Americans are unhappy about the Chinese subsidizing their solar panels. So there's going to be a lot of trade issues that are going to come. But in my mind, someone wrote about this, not my original thought, what we're really seeing is a industrial policy war as various jurisdictions are trying to grab the pieces of this and develop real leadership in this space. And in particular, New York is trying to get the blade and turbine tower production facilities located in New York, not in Virginia, not in Rhode Island. So even within the US states, there's going to be jurisdictional sort of competition to use this as a lever for for economic development. So that's the story. I think it's ultimately an optimistic story. There's a lot of obstacles, but exciting time to sort of learn about this stuff and get involved in it. There's huge amounts of work to be done. Yep. Yeah. Nuclear at the level of sort of the big gigawatt plants is just hideously expensive. 25 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. We have nuclear plants in New York that we're subsidizing to keep open because even on their operating cost basis, they lose money. So it's 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour, and renewables are coming in at 3 or 4 cents. We shouldn't shut our existing nuclear fleet down because they're built and it's giving us carbon-free energy. There is a push to try and develop small-scale nuclear plants. And part of the reason that nuclear is so expensive and very high risk, so that private investors don't want to touch it, is, they're just hideously expensive. They're 10, 12, $15 billion for a plant. And you also have to envision that for 40 years, people are going to want to buy that power, right? Because so you have to have a captive market to feed into that. And in a world of distributed energy, that's just no bets there. So you do see them still being built, where you've got states who are willing to subsidize them, like France or China or Korea, but just not the solution. People are working on 100 megawatt plants, sort of a tenth the size of the gigawatt plants, that are supposed to be much safer and, still going to have waste issues, but those will come online. The first ones will come online in maybe 2029 or 2030. So people are betting on them to really help us develop some baseload capacity, maybe, if they work out. There was one just permitted for an experimental facility in 2029 in Idaho. But it's a solution for the 2030s, if at all. The other really cool baseload technology that could emerge in the 2030s is geothermal electricity production, which essentially builds on fracking technology. So you drill down, you frack the rock at a kilometer down where it's really hot, then you push water through it and you get steam that drives turbines. So that also is a really interesting kind of baseload technology option. You drill down and then you frack out like that.
But for the geothermal, you can do it, you don't have to drill, that's one way, you drill deep,
Yeah.
but below 5 feet.
Yes.
Earth's surface, there's constant temperature,
Yeah.
so you can actually basically dig, a field and then cover it up.
Yes, so BARD does a lot of our heating and cooling with geothermal, but that's for heating and cooling. I'm talking about for electricity production. And this would be where you dig deep and you get basically steam driving turbines as a way to, really create sort of megawatt scale electricity production. The one problem with that one is it causes earthquakes. Mild earthquakes so far, but yeah. Yes, I mean, it's complicated. There's some positives, there's some negatives. So it's really a question of mitigating where possible and accepting some loss and trying to get as many benefits as you can. But yeah, I'd urge you to go to the NYSERDA offshore wind site, and there's just gobs of information about their thinking about that. One of the issues is noise during construction, and so trying to do construction at a time when is not in breeding season or when they're not around. They're looking at floating offshore wind for deep sea offshore wind right now, which is really interesting technology where you don't have to drive piles into the ocean floor. So yeah, it's complicated, but it's not devastating. It's not like no one anticipates that it's going to sort of wipe out species or anything like that. It does have negative impacts, but also positive impacts in terms of habitat. Yeah.
Is there competition for leadership on industrial policy, like dangerous for countries who haven't traditionally led in like economic policy, like especially in the global south?
I don't think so, because the result is that it's driving down costs and prices. So that's what's exciting about, the solar revolution, right? Is that, people all over the world in low income and poor countries are going to get access to cheap solar panels, um, and make it possible that you don't have to be connected to the grid in order to have the benefits of electricity. I mean, the people who are leading it are going to get the benefits of the, of the manufacturing. But yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned production is a hard to decarbonize sector
Mm-hmm.
with steel and concrete.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I think about all the production that's going to be required to build these wind and solar components, and how does that
Yeah.
pan out?
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're thinking, okay, what are the pathways to the future? Well, you could have a future that was reliant on fossil fuels, and that would require you to build pipelines and manufacture stuff and drill, right? Or you have a renewable future where you build windmills and solar, right? So it's not like either way, you're going to build a lot of stuff and use a lot of steel. And, in the case of renewables, you won't be causing oil spills and, pumping gases into the atmosphere. So that's why you would pursue a renewable pathway. People have looked at kind of what is the relative mining burden, for example, of a renewable future versus a fossil fuel future. And the real advantage of renewables, think about fossil fuels. How do you do that? Well, you dig up some stuff, you transport it, you burn it, right? And you have to do that every day, right? You dig up some stuff, you transport it, you burn it. You have to do that every day. With renewables, you dig up some stuff, you manufacture some stuff, and then you're done, right? Bill McKibben has a quote that something like 40% of global shipping is just moving oil and coal around. 40% of the entire global ocean shipping is just moving oil and coal around. If you look at the mining burden, it's about how much stuff you actually have to pull out of the ground. It's about 1% of the renewable future versus the fossil fuel future. You have to move more earth to get to that stuff, so it's more like a 20% trade-off. So in terms of the land sort of impacted, it's about 20% in the renewable space versus the fossil fuel space. So there is pollution, there will be exploitation of communities, and we need to minimize all that stuff, but it's essentially moving towards a circular economy, right? Batteries in particular, if we can figure out how to recycle them, are inherently circular because they have valuable metals in them. So whereas with the fossil fuel economy, you're waste, take, make, waste, right? That's the model versus the renewable system, which is, inherently more circular. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, you talked about the offshore wind on the East Coast. Is that the same infrastructure happening on the West Coast?
Not yet, because we've got a continental shelf on this side, so it's pretty shallow. But on the west side, it's trench, so it's pretty deep. So you don't really have the resource out there, which is why people are looking at floating offshore wind as a kind of an alternative to that. Any other questions? We had a lot of student questions. That's great. So.
So when we think about industrial policy, we really also think about big push government support.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing both parts in your story. I'm hearing that there is competition globally among governments, potentially to lead, and that actually industry is like behind this process. At the same time, all of these stories of scale.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's the horse and buggy story that you're telling, but do you see at the policy level the kind of fiscal support and industrial support for the scale of the intervention that's required? So technology seems to be there, available, but do you see that kind of scale that we associate with like the New Deal transformation, the interstate highway system,
Yeah.
the electrification of the nation? Do we have this kind of industrial support on the fiscal side?
Yeah, I think so. I think the issue is not fiscal so much because there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, in some ways, what happened is this is really not so much about, well, there is infrastructure around transmission lines and whatnot, charging stations. But a lot of it is competitive provision of things that people want. And so there's a lot of private investment capital that is sort of sitting on the sidelines ready to jump in. And if you just think about solar power, right? I mean, it's just dirt cheap. And so if you can find a place to site it and have access to a transmission line, you're going to make a lot of money. So it's more, I think the obstacles are less around capital. I think there's plenty of capital that's ready to move into the space. But it's around how do you enable that capital to get in there, especially in the face of, skilled worker shortages, siting opposition. That's probably, in the US, probably the biggest obstacle, is that there's a lot of people that want renewable energy, but they don't want it anywhere close to them. And so finding, sort of overcoming local community opposition to wind, solar, transmission, those are probably the bigger obstacles. I think the money is there because you can definitely make a lot of money in this space as soon as those things, because the heavy lifting by government was already done, right? I mean, essentially, it's been for the last 40 years that they've been making the R&D investments to drive down the prices, and now the private sector is pretty poised to take over. I think. Yeah.
Not so much a question, but an idea about solar structure. So I've noticed, especially in the Hudson Valley, we have a lot of storage units,
Mm-hmm.
big buildings or a lot of small individual buildings, and they all have flat tops
Sure.
and not a lot of daylight.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a great place to put solar panels.
Like storage type places or yeah, no, yeah. The economics of rooftop or distributed solar aren't quite there yet to sort of have the market, that excited about them. Although really, it's got more to do with the grid and transmission systems, but those costs are coming down, and this is where you kind of get to the horse and buggy story, right? At some point, it's going to be cheaper to put solar panels on your commercial building and put in a battery storage system than it is to buy power from the grid.
But is it
Right?
going to be like each building has its own solar power, or is it one big building can have enough panels to like feed a bunch of other buildings? Or is
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that's true. Yeah, I mean, depending on what's going on in those areas. But as soon as it's cheaper to even pay sort of a chunk of your electricity, if you can put up your panels, store the power so that you've got, enough to keep you going, 24/7, and you don't, right now you have to get permission from the utility, right? So there's this monopoly sort of entity that can say no to you about your solar installation, and they will because it really threatens their business model, right? But as soon as there's a situation where you don't need their permission, and you can just, have a little microgrid, that's powering some significant portion of your operation, that's where you could begin to see very rapid transition that could be quite challenging for grid stability and all of that stuff if people start to defect from the utilities and start generating their own power locally. And I think that's coming. pretty soon. So, yeah, that's another disruptive element. Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot about how the policy is changing and the political environment is changing regarding this topic. And I was wondering, what are the things that we as students should keep in mind? Sort of a big question, but what can we?
In terms of policy,
I would say like the government is doing all this stuff,
yep.
but like as a maybe like a citizen.
Well, I would say it's a great place to work. So, you know, if you want an exciting and interesting career, you know, get involved in this energy transition. And you can do it, you know, from the policy side, you can do it from the business side, you can do it from, you know, all sorts of different angles. I recognize it as a very rapidly growing sector where there's really interesting opportunities to solve some of these problems from a community advocacy perspective, whatever. And of course, you know, as a citizen, you know, you want to be supportive of, you know, a just transition, a rapid just transition, right? So support, you know, politicians who can do this stuff. You know, I think of it typically in sort of the personal, professional, and political realms, you know. Yeah, so consumer investing, you know, all of your decisions can really be part of this sort of system transformation. I'm going to wrap it now because I'd like to talk a little bit about our graduate program. So thank you, I should say thank you all for being here. So.